Greetings, friends of liberty. Those laws dealing with the poor, the vagrant, mendicant, and the disabled, the so-called poor laws, I must say presently, from a humane point of view, are not entirely satisfactory. Yet the problem posed by the poor and those in want, in the end, admits of only one true solution. Over time, that we in England continue to increase our industrial and agricultural productivity as we have now noticeably for over a century. The difficulty in treating the poor lies on the one hand in that one surely doesn't desire the encouragement of idleness in granting undue favors from the public purse, and yet on the other, a lack of charity to the deserving poor would do England no honor indeed. Partly the answer seems to lie in the treating the poor through the local parish, where they in their character are better known so that those deserving of aid are more readily distinguished from those disinclined to work. However, if we turn to your 21st century in North America, we find, as it seems, in the United States, quite an extraordinary occurrence. Much larger swaths of the male population than ever before who occupy themselves largely with watching television, and a society that tolerates this idleness. To analyze this remarkable phenomenon, we have the political economist Nicholas Eberstadt, author of over 17 books, amongst them The Poverty of Communism, A Nation of Takers, America's Entitlement Epidemic, and Our Miserable 21st Century. In this 2016 work, Eberstadt is busy at work writing Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, and as a consummate statistician and demographer skillfully lays out the evidence for his contention of a growing crisis of serious social and economic consequence. He begins in this tiny 185-page book, so tiny it needed half-sized pages to reach even that length, by describing the problem. Over 7 million men aged 25 to 54 no longer participating in the labor force, or around 10.5 million aged 20 to 64, not in the labor force either because they don't want to work, can't work, are students, or are taking care of children. These rates are comparable to the Great Depression, both in 1930 and 1940. Or put another way, the problem being that between 1948 and 2015, the work rate for U.S. men 20 and older fell from 85.8% to 68.2%. Notable as well is the genial indifference with which society has greeted this fact. Given these numbers, he conscientiously asks, are there any obvious adjustments we should make compared to earlier times? What factors should we control for? Are they all the same? And the answer is no, there is one major difference. More people are in school or training now, upwards of 2.5 million, than in 1965. But since somewhere between 55 and 70% of those continue to work anyway, that number really is reduced to about 1 million students, so the deficit still is around 9.5 to 10 million compared to 1965. That translates to about 10% more men working in 1965 than now. And that, of course, is a huge number. As Eberstadt says, Romans used the word decimation to describe the loss of 1/10 of a given unit of men. The United States has suffered something akin to a decimation of its male workforce over the past 50 years. You can, in fact, see this occur successively by generation in a colored chart that he gives, showing the progressively lower labor force participation rate by color for each of the 5 birth cohorts from 1933 to 1982. Now, if we look at the distaff side of the equation, we don't see any slackers there. No siree. The female labor force participation rate about doubled from 34 to 69% from 1948 to 2015, as it did in many Western countries.
although it should be noted that it peaked around 74% in the year 2000 and has since declined about 5%. And if we now ask how American men fare compared to the men of other countries, Eberstadt shows the startling results. He provides a beautiful color graph showing the data lines for 24 countries, ranging from France, Spain, and Austria to Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. And we see that while the US was in the middle of the group at around 96.5% participation in 1968, by 2014 it had plummeted to second to last after the macaronis at 89.5% for those aged 25 to 54. This means that even the worst countries in Europe, hidebound with labor regulation and bureaucracy, such as France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Ireland, all have better participation rates except for the Guidos. As Eberstadt says, and so the puzzle. America has a more robust economy, a more flexible and dynamic labor market, and a more limited welfare state than any of these 6 countries. But it has failed to keep its younger men in the workforce at the level that these struggling nations, with the exception of Italy, have achieved. Why? And all this is even more curious by the fact that Americans overall as a group work more than people in many other countries, and definitely more than the 6 countries just listed. Eberstadt now turns to the question of determining the nature of these men who choose not to participate in the labor market. Who are they? They are, by race, black, the least participating, then white, and finally Hispanic, the most participating. By educational status, they are high school dropouts, the least participating, those with college higher. By marriage status, the unmarried, less participating, versus the married, more. And finally, by birth location, native-born, less participating than foreign-born. Let's now touch on how these men not working use their time. If we go back far enough, of course, previous generations of our parents and grandparents went so far as to regard idle hands as the devil's workshop. As he says, the Protestant ethic maintained that waste of time is thus the first and in principle the deadliest of sins. But that attitude among both the working and non-working populations has moderated drastically over time. And now surveys show that per day, for the non-working, over 10 hours are spent in sleep and personal care, which was close to the amount for working women, about 2 hours on household care, which was identical to working women, but 6 hours less on work than for working women. And what did they use those 6 hours for? Socializing, relaxing, and leisure. Primarily watching television, where the difference in time between working women is close to 5 hours more. And this same huge gap of leisure time was found between non-working men who weren't students and those who were. Having seen then the unproductive way in which non-working men use their time, what Eberstadt finally focuses on is the extent to which possible demand-side factors, in other words, a change in the economy, like a loss of manufacturing jobs attendant to globalization or stagnation of the U.S. economy by overregulation, might play a role. Regarding manufacturing, he notes that if manufacturing losses were a serious problem, they should affect foreign-born and native workers equally. But this is not the case. Foreign-born workers have much higher rates of labor force participation. Secondly, while he believes that stagnation of the economy might be a factor, if we look at other countries with stagnant economies, Japan being a classic case, men and women in Japan work more than men and women in the United States overall. Another interesting question that Eberstadt examines, trying to fully see the nature of this whole problem, is how do America's unworking men support themselves? Given that fully half of not in the labor forces reported no wage income at all, and that their median income is about $10,000 per year. And the answer is here, it turns out, as we might expect, is that they're supported by their families and women on the one hand and the government on the other. So 63% of males in 2013 received one or more means-tested benefits, while only 23% of employed men did. Food stamps were received by 41% of those not in the labor force and only 9% of those employed. Finally, Medicaid was received by 53% of those not in the labor force, but only 18% of those working. Next, Eberstadt notes that while the 60s inaugurated the welfare state, which is highly implicated in joblessness, it also inaugurated at that time a crime wave. And so the question of criminality and its relation to joblessness arises as well. Not surprisingly, on this metric too, as he says, having a criminal record is a key missing piece in explaining why work rates and labor force participation rates have collapsed much more dramatically in America than other affluent Western societies over the past 2 generations. The reality is that America, of course, sends many more people to prison than any nation in the world, and while levels of crime now have returned to what they were in the 60s, at least until the recent crime surge, the incarceration rates, on the other hand, are roughly 5 times as high as in the 60s. This understandably has dramatic consequences for the job prospects of ex-cons, since, as he says, maybe 90% of all sentenced felons today are out of confinement and living more or less among us. Simply because most have served their time and have been released or was sentenced merely to some form of probation instead. Their population is estimated at somewhere between 16 and 20 million Americans. When we look at these ex-cons by race, we find that whites are least likely to be ex-cons, Hispanics next, and blacks the most. We also find that the level of education correlates with criminality, with high school dropouts having the most criminality. So if we compare these factors, we find, for example, that black high school dropouts have a 58% chance of a prison term, and the lowest by whites with some college, a 1.2% chance of a prison term. When we then look at the labor participation rates of these ex-cons, we see the enormous effect of both prior criminality and education. In one of the over 35 colored graphs that made this book a pleasure for those who love stats, Eberstadt illustrates the cumulative effects of race, education, and prior criminal history by showing that for blacks, 45% of those with 1 or more prison terms are not in the labor force compared to 5% with no prison terms, and that for whites, the corresponding figures are 22% and 2%. B, if we look at all races combined, of those with a less than high school education and 1 term in prison, 35% are not in the labor force compared with 7% of those who were never in prison. And C, of all races combined, if they have a bachelor's degree, whether or not they spend time in prison, only 2% were not in the labor force. So the conclusion here, obviously, is that staying out of jail and getting some education are highly correlated with long-term productive work habits. So what all this means is that the high rates of incarceration are highly correlated with the American rate of non-work compared to other countries. In conclusion, Eberstadt again reiterates that he believes that it is a problem so urgent, so immense, that it should demand immediate attention and action, though it is one we have somehow collectively managed more or less to ignore. He adds, socially, the male retreat from the labor force has further exacerbated family breakdown, promoted welfare dependence, recast disability into a viable alternative lifestyle, and routinized the support of men of prime working age by women. So as he says, as a certain Russian revolutionary did over a century ago, what should be done? He recommends that we devote closer attention to 3 broad issues. Number 1, revitalizing American business and its job-generating capacities. Number 2, reducing the immense and perverse disincentives against male work embedded in our social welfare programs. And 3, coming to terms with the enormous challenge of bringing convicts and felons back into our economy and society. He notes that 2 decades ago, the U.S. successfully revamped its lackadaisical method of treating female welfare dependency, and that the same approach could likely be effective if done with males. My suggestions would be that he's right about welfare, but that the best solution would be to get the public sector out of it entirely, relying, as Americans used to, on private charity and philanthropy. That would be by far the most effective. Secondly, the drug war is highly destructive since it tempts young, uneducated people to crime and violence. So eliminating the drug war would at once reduce rates of criminality and violence enormously. Thirdly, of course, public education, especially for minorities, shortchanges them in their needed acquisition of knowledge, and so privatizing all K-12 education would also be productive, although more indirect. All in all, I'd give this book an A- for its competent focus on one specific problem, for its ability to address many potentially related factors and issues, and again for the huge number of colored graphs and tables that help one easily digest the information presented. Happy again to live in an England where we certainly don't much subsidize delinquency and idleness, except for some few to be found in the House of Lords and at White's, Brooks, and Almack's. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.